So even though there's been all this conversation about human cloning, and we're not anywhere close to being able to do that, and but they're still having the discussion and the debate about human cloning. Well, before you can even think about creating a human by cloning, it would require scientists to be able to safely and reliably clone monkeys, chimps, and apes. And after they've achieved those results, be able to then do it under controlled situations consistently, and then they'd be able to even think about applying this technology to humans. But they're not even close to being able uh, to clone a primate. So talking about it in terms of humans is not even on the realm of possibilities at this point. But in you considering that in the future, one of the things that another issue that's talked about is deciding what's for the good of the child. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a topic that we're going to get to in a little bit. Looking at, knowing that this was the method of birth, would that cause any physical harm, physiological harm, any psychological harm, emotional harm to the child? So that's one of the things that we considered, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, what's wrong with this if the family has no other options for a child of their own that shares their own DNA and they want to continue their own bloodline? So that's one of the other arguments is, so what's wrong with it if they want to do that? And then this kind of technology or this ability would give that family a closer genetic connection to the child than, say, adoption would, where there's really no genetic connection. So again, lots of issues to discuss with regard to this topic, which brings us to the next topic, which is using one baby for another, and we're going to talk about this in a couple of different ways. But some of the more famous cases, the first one is Baby Faye from 1984, and she was 3 weeks premature. She weighed 5 pounds at birth. Her color wasn't good. The pediatrician noticed that, transferred her to Loma Linda Hospital. She was diagnosed with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which affects 1 in 10,000 babies, and it leaves the normally powerful left side of the heart and aorta underdeveloped and too weak to be able to pump the blood. And it almost always kills the infants within their first 2 weeks of life. Faye's mother was 23-year-old. She's unmarried. She was unemployed. She had no medical insurance. She did live with Faye's father, who was a 35-year-old laborer. They had a son and had lived together for 5 years, but at Faye's birth, they separated. So at Loma Linda, the doctors told Mom that Faye would soon die. They kept her overnight in the hospital and then released her. Mom had Faye baptized, took her to a motel, and waited for her to die. Leonard Bailey, who was the 41-year-old chief of pediatric surgery at Loma Linda, suggested that baby Faye could receive a xenograft from a baboon. So when you transplant an organ from one species to another, it's called a xenograft. And in 1964, James Hardy was implanted a chimp heart into a 68-year-old man. 68-year-old man lived 90 minutes. There was other transplants with monkey kidneys. Other doctors had done it, but they never really successfully worked for a significant period of time. In 1975, a cardiologist connected the veins and arteries of a 1-year-old boy to a live baboon. Neither of them lived through the operation. There was another baboon heart transplant. Person lived 300 minutes. And then another one that the person lived for 4 days. So Dr. Bailey had been aggressively pursuing this for several years, and he had performed about 160 different surgeries, mostly on sheep and goats, but none of them had survived for more than 6 months. So on October 19th, Bailey readmitted baby Faye, placed her on a respirator, and then discussed the operation with mom, dad, and grandma. Parents signed a consent form, and then they say it had been reviewed and was fully approved by the IRB. So they started doing some testing, took several days. They looked at Faye's reaction to her own blood as a tissue for control, and then they did testing on different baboons to be able to find one that wouldn't have a significant reaction. So the baby Faye was so about 70% of humans have an antibody against baboon tissue. Baby Faye was among the 30% who didn't. So because the even though chimpanzees are closer to humans in evolution, Bailey was asked why he picked a baboon rather than a chimpanzee, and he said he had a rather humorous, now thinking about it, response. He said he didn't believe in evolution, which is interesting because it's typically scientists do believe in evolution. So after they were able to have all of the testing done and they found one that they thought would be suitable, the transplant was scheduled to take place. Faye was placed on a heart-lung machine, lowered her blood temperature, and the baboon's name was Goobers, and he was sedated, and they took out her heart, took out Goober's heart, replaced Faye's with Goober's, and over the next several hours, they, took for the surgery, they transplanted the heart, brought Faye's temperature back up to normal body temperature, and Goober's heart immediately began to beat spontaneously. So on October 29th, that was 3 days later, they weaned Faye from her respirator. A couple days after that, about 6 days, Bailey predicted that her heart would do well and that she would probably go on to celebrate her 20th birthday. Lots of other doctors started weighing in on this and were touting the use of simian organs for transplants. And it was about 2 weeks later that Faye started to show signs of rejection of that donor heart, and she deteriorated, went back on a respirator. November 15th, she developed a heart blockage and renal failure. They tried closed heart massage and dialysis, but she died after having lived 21 days with the baboon heart. Bailey never tried any more animal transplants, but there were other surgeons who did. In 1992, there was one transplant of a baboon liver into a person with hepatitis B who lived 70 days. There was a woman waiting for a human liver in Los Angeles. She received a pig liver as a bridge transplant, but she died 32 hours later. A man with hepatitis B received a baboon liver. He died during the operation. So, there haven't been really successes in these xenografts, but that'll lead to, or is kind of a reason for some of the controversy around the baby Faye case. There, just to bring other controversy up, is the Ontario Protocol, and then anencephalic babies. So there was a lot of media coverage over baby Faye's stories, and it brought Dr. Bailey and Loma Linda Hospital to the forefront. And although this xenograph failed, he used it to create a fame for infants and heart transplants in particular for babies, and particularly with regard to anencephalic babies. So in 1987, these people who were supportive of Bailey's goal to be able to use babies, and I'll explain what anencephaly is in a second, they met in a conference and created guidelines that were known as the Ontario Protocol. So anencephaly is a congenital neurological disorder, and it's characterized by the absence of the cerebrum and cerebellum as well as the top of the skull. So it results in exposure of the brainstem. It doesn't mean complete absence of the head or brain. There is a brainstem. An electroencephalogram can be taken. Autonomic functions such as breathing and heartbeat can be present. So they don't meet the criteria of brain death. And that's going to be part of the controversy related to this as we continue this discussion. It's probably the most serious birth defect because the baby essentially lacks the higher brain necessary for development. They're described as being born dying. There's no hope of growth into childhood or adulthood. The open skull is vulnerable to infection, and most people born with this condition die within a week, though some rare cases they've lived for about a year. So this babies that are born with this anencephaly are major potential sources for organs for other babies born needing organs. And that creates a tremendous bioethical issue about whether to use these anencephalic babies as such. It's hard when you need an organ for a baby to find a baby donor because babies aren't often in accidents where the body and organs are going to be intact. Or if a baby has dies of sudden infant death syndrome or something, oftentimes their organs are impaired. So, having a source of viable organs can be challenging. So these babies that were born with anencephaly were a good potential source for donor organs. The important guideline of that Ontario protocol stated that the anencephalic baby could become a donor, but only after being pronounced dead by the classical criteria of brain death. So that made it really challenging because what they were trying to achieve is ensuring that the donor was born dying. But at birth, they're put on a respirator to preserve its organ. Then to determine whether they're brain dead, they're taking off the respirator every 6 hours to see if they can breathe on their own. So if a baby failed to breathe for 3 minutes, it could be declared brain dead. 3 physicians had to declare it so, and then they had to be independent of the transplant team. So it leads to a lot of challenges. It's important to note that the respirator is necessary in the protocol because the heart is gradually stopping beating, and you want to preserve the organs. And if you start to have anoxia, the organs will begin to deteriorate. So by the time the brainstem is dead, the heart and kidneys may no longer be functional or useful for transplantation. So you have to be able to maintain the organs to the extent that is possible. So by maintaining the brainstem, you're also preventing potential donor from becoming brain dead. So it's this vicious circle. You're preserving the life because they're dying, but you can't use the organs. So there were a lot of issues with that. So in 1987, there was a Canadian couple, Karen and Fred Schutten, and they learned that after 8 months of pregnancy, their fetus had anencephaly, and they decided to bring it to term and donate its organs. When her heart began to fail after birth, the baby, who was named Gabrielle, was put on the ventilator. The United Network for Organ Sharing was alerted, but there weren't any potential recipients who were found in Canada or North America. Meanwhile, cut to Loma Linda Hospital again, Dr. Bailey was working with another couple, Gordon and Alice Holk, who are also Canadian, whose 8-month-old fetus had the same heart issue and needed a heart transplant. And they had come to Loma Linda because of the publicity around the program. The Schottens and baby Gabrielle flew to Loma Linda. They met the Holks, and their baby Paul was delivered prematurely by cesarean section to be able to get the heart.